In today's video, I'm going to take you through my step-by-step process for shooting a landscape photo at sunset. Now, the first part of the process is always finding the location. This particular location is someplace I'm familiar with. I've shot before, it's not far from home, and if you're just learning photography, those are the spots where you're going to learn the most because you're not worried about being in an unusual location or how long it takes to get there or how to get there or where to park or anything like that. So when you're first learning, look for those places that are nearby, that are easy to get to. It doesn't matter if it's not like the perfect, beautiful location, but it helps if it looks pretty good. So this particular spot is not far from where I live. It is right off a highway. It's kind of one of my go-to spots. As you can see, there's this old farmhouse, I think from like the 1800s or something, and the sun just happens to set right behind it. So this is a perfect place to learn a little bit about shooting sunset photography. All right, so first I want to talk about finding a location. I use an app called PhotoPills. It is probably the best photographer helpful app that you can get. If you don't have it already, there's going to be a link in the description. You should definitely check it out. It's probably my most used app for both landscape and portrait photography. The only thing it doesn't tell you is the weather, so grab a weather app for that. But this app tells you where the sun's going to set, when the sun is going to set. It has a map where you can see the direction that the sun's pointing. So I checked the PhotoPills app before today, and I knew that the sun was going to be setting right behind this old farmhouse, and it was going to be the perfect day for this type of shot because of where the sun was going to be and when it was going to set. The other app I like to use for sunset photography specifically is an app called My Sunset. It does a pretty good job of predicting when you're going to get colorful sunsets like this. It takes into consideration cloud cover and weather and that kind of thing. A perfectly sunny day with no clouds is not going to give you much color, and of course a totally overcast day is just going to be drab. So you want certain types of clouds, certain amount of cloud cover to give you a colorful sunset. The next thing I want to worry about, now that I have my location, I know that it's going to be a good day for a sunset, is the composition. So in this particular scene, we've got a fence, an old fence, probably as old as this farmhouse. We've got, that's the foreground. We've got the midground is kind of the farmhouse itself. And then the background is, of course, the field and the sunset itself. So we got lucky today. There was some, so it looks like some planes going across the sky. So we got cool trails for the planes. And we've got all our elements of composition, in this case, the basic elements we want for any photo. When you're shooting sunset into the sun, the sunset itself is usually your background element. That's kind of your focus, your centerpiece of the image. You want to make sure the lines in the image kind of all converge on the sunset. And in this case, I've got the farmhouse at an angle so that the lines of the farmhouse are pointing towards the sunset. So the sun is starting to set pretty quickly, so I want to make sure I get the shot before we lose our daylight. Now let's talk about camera settings. For a sunset shot like this, you don't necessarily need a long exposure. I like the clouds here. I'm going to experiment with some long exposures, but the goal here is to expose for the sky itself. I want to make sure that the sky is exposed properly, and I'm going to do a couple things to make sure I do that. So now we're set up so you can see what I'm doing on the camera itself. I'm using live view, and we're gonna shoot at f12 in this case, or f13 in this case. I'm shooting with a pretty wide lens. It's my Tamron 17 to 35 lens. It's probably my favorite landscape lens, and we're gonna go into about, let's call it 20 to 22 here, so we can get the farmhouse and a lot of that sky. I'm going to tilt up a little bit to get more of that sky because I really like the way the sky looks. So we're at ISO 100, base ISO. You want to get the most quality out of this. We're at F13. Let's back it down to, F13 is good. F13 is good here. And I'm going to, for this particular shot, I'm going to go to about 1/50th of a second. But before I do that, I want to make sure I have focus. For that, I'm going to zoom in I'm going to go to this foreground here, and I like to shoot landscapes in manual focus. Make sure I've got them in focus. Leave it in manual focus. And then once I get, right now I'm focusing on the foreground, this fence, and then I want to check the farmhouse itself to make sure that's still in focus. At f13, I should have enough depth of field that I don't have to worry about that. That looks good. Now let's back off and frame the shot. I want to make sure the camera is level, because if you can get it level in the camera, you're not going to have to rotate it after the fact and lose some of your shot. So let's make that. First I want to expose for the sky, and that's about 1/50th of a second. The foreground's dark here, but the sky looks good. So I'm going to take that shot. Now I'm going to go 2 stops up, or 2 stops down, however you want to look at it, to 1/13th of a second and get that foreground exposed right. So there's a couple reasons I'm bracketing shots here. First, it just gives me a better chance of getting the exposure right in one shot. I'm shooting with a Nikon D750, great dynamic range, great low light, so even though it's an older camera. So I think there's a good chance, the sun's not super bright, there's a good chance I get all the range I need in one shot, but if I bracket, that gives me enough flexibility in post that I can choose the one that I like the best. The other thing is, if you don't have enough dynamic range in one shot, if you bracket, then you can blend in later on. So here's some of the results we've got. If you want to see how I post-processed these images, make sure you check out my Lightroom course. There's going to be a link in the description if you're interested. I also have a free introductory course for anyone that's really just getting started with Lightroom and just wants to know how to jump in and get started with it. Normally, shooting landscapes, I use a circular polarizing filter pretty often. However, we're shooting into the sun here, and a circular polarizer is not going to do anything. You need to be generally at a 90 to 45, between a 90 and 45 degree angle to the sun to get any type of effect or benefit from using a polarizer. So there's really no benefit here to using one, so we're not going to use one. But you can use an ND filter shooting into the sun. The ND filter, of course, lowers the exposure. In this particular scene right now, the sun's kind of hidden behind some lower clouds, even though we haven't reached the actual sunset time yet. But if I throw an ND filter on here, I can create a long exposure that'll give me a different look to the image. So for this shot, I am going to try one with an ND filter. And I've been using the Case ND filters. I don't know if you can see that here. The reason I use these now, really the main reason is, first, their optical quality is impeccable. It's as good as any others I've tried. And they're super thin and magnetic. So I've already got the adapter on here. I can just pop that on and it's not going to come off. These things have like changed the workflow, made it so much easier and faster. So I just threw an ND1000 on there. That's a 10-stop ND. So I'm going to go all the way down to 30 seconds on this shot. And you know what? I'm going to bump up the ISO to 200 a little, just to balance that out, because it's not quite perfect at 30 seconds. And let's see how that looks. So for that shot at 30 seconds, I really like the way it looked. It came out perfect. A little bit of an underexposed foreground, but with this camera, that's okay. And the sky is exposed perfectly. I liked the effect of the 30-second exposure on this shot. The other thing you want to do when you're shooting a landscape shot, we were losing the light quickly, but don't forget to move your camera around. I mean, I'm parked in one spot here for demonstration, but move your camera around, look for different locations. Do this, what a lot of people forget. Flip your camera. It may seem like the dumbest and simplest thing, but sometimes rotating your camera can be a huge benefit and give you shots that look completely different and give you a completely different perspective on the same shot. So there you have it. Pretty simple. Scout out your location. Make sure you pick the right location. Use some of those apps that I put in the description. Pay attention to your composition. Make sure your lines are all pointed where you want them to. Find your focus in the image. Find the part of the image that's most interesting. For a shot like this where the sun is in the image, that's probably the sun or something brighter in the image. And you want to make sure things are converging, lines are converging on that sun, and that'll be the basics of your composition. Things like the rule of thirds are also important to keep in mind when you're shooting images like this. Then for exposure, expose for your highlights. Most modern cameras are going to handle the shadows much better than the highlights. In other words, you can bring those up. Again, in post-processing, it's harder to bring the highlights down in post-processing, but bracket your images as well so that you have lighter images, darker images. You can choose the right one, or if you need to, you can blend them together. Lastly, take multiple shots, different locations, rotate your camera, get different orientations for the shot, and it'll give you a better chance of getting the one you want. Remember, even the best landscape photographers in the world aren't going out there and taking one shot and leaving. They're working a scene, shooting probably hundreds of shots at one scene just to get the images that you see on social media. So go out there, work the scene, practice, try these steps, right? Just go to your local park and shoot a sunset and see what you can create. And then when you're ready to travel to the more exotic locations or faraway locations that are more interesting, you'll be ready. There you have it. Thanks for watching.